Welcome everyone to this great talk by Professor VanGrasstek. He's professor at the Kennedy School of Government at the Harvard University. Today's great talk by Professor VanGrasstek is called The Eroding Foundations of American Leadership. Can the multilateral trading system survive when it is everyone's plan B? Usually, when we think about plan B, we think about it as a kind of safety net that guarantees achieving goals in a different manner or with different tools. I am sure that we are all eager to hear Dr. VanGrasstek, since the title of his presentation hints that Plan B might not be a many splendor thing. We have previously introduced Professor VanGrasstek, but just for the record, and for those who join us for the first time, I will share a short bio of Professor VanGrasstek. Professor VanGrasstek, according to The Economist, keeps a sharp eye on the politics and trade. His book on trade and American leadership, The Paradoxes of Power and Wealth, from Alexander Hamilton to Donald Trump, examines the shifting place of trade policy in the grand strategy of the United States, from independence to the struggle with China for global primacy. He also wrote The History and Future of the World Trade Organization, as well as numerous other books, articles, and monographs. Dr. VanGrasstek has taught courses on trade policy at Harvard University since the year 2000, and has also taught international economics at the American University School of International Service. He also wrote The History and Future of the World Trade Organization, as well as numerous other books, articles, and monographs. He also wrote The History and Future of the World Trade Organization, as well as numerous other books, articles, and monographs. Dr. VanGrasstek has taught courses on trade policy at Harvard Kennedy School since the year 2000, and he has also taught international economics at the American University School of International Service and Literature at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He has also lectured in the diplomatic academies in the United States, the United Kingdom, and 10 other countries. He received his doctorate in political science from Princeton University and a Master of Science in Foreign Service degree from Georgetown University. He has provided advisory, analytical, and training services to numerous international organizations, national governments, and private firms in over 4,000 countries. Manuela Tortora, our Vice President at GreyTalks, will conduct this session. Manuela, the floor is yours. He received his doctorate in political science from Princeton University and a Master of Science in Foreign Service degree from Georgetown University. He has provided advisory, analytical, and training services to numerous international organizations, national governments, and private firms in over 4,000 countries. Manuela Tortora, our Vice President at GreyTalks, will conduct the session. Manuela, the floor is yours, and thank you very much again, Dr. VanGrasstek, for being with us. Manuela Tortora, our Vice President at GreyTalks, will conduct the session. Manuela, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Alejandro. Well, so Craig, this is the third time that we are using your crystal ball, or well, rather you will use it and share the results of the crystal ball with us. In the two previous crystal ball sessions, I think you were quite accurate in your forecast. And I'm pretty sure that you will also very accurate in this one, but we will tell that in a few months, right? So the focus is on Biden's policy, what sort of scenario, what sort of options you envisage for him. Also taking into account that there are a lot of expectations about Biden as compared to the Trump administration, and I think I do not need to elaborate. One thing that certainly you will explain to us is to what extent these expectations are good or bad or realistic or unrealistic expectations. Then there is a topic also that I'm sure you will address, which is a more technical one, but is really connected to the political aspects of the trade and economic policy of Biden, which is to what extent he will use discriminatory, preferential sort of trade arrangements, economic arrangements with some partners according to obviously political criteria, political priorities. So this, I think, as compared to the NMF sort of overall regime applicable to everybody in theory, this is a key question, but that will determine to what extent we will have a multilateral revamped WTO in the future or not. And then in general, I'm pretty sure, because I think I know you now, after I don't know how many years, I will not tell you how many years, we know each other, but certainly a topic that you will address is the linkages between the purely political considerations, sometimes even ideological, and how they influence, how they determine the trade policy of the US at the multilateral, but also at the regional and bilateral levels. So the floor is yours, Craig.
Okay, thank you very much, Manuel. Let me first get to my screen here. I will say one little change from what you suggested, which is the previous two talks. Yes, you could tell within a matter of months whether I was right or wrong. Middle of last year, I told you that Biden was almost certain to win. And at the end of last year, when we were still awaiting the final results of the election, I said that Trump would do almost anything to stay in power, and I predicted that it would be very difficult. I think both of those predictions turned out to be correct, but what I'm going to talk about now is something for which you won't know in a couple of months whether I'm right or wrong. It's a matter of a couple of years or a couple of decades, because I'm going to be taking a much longer view here. When people ask me to describe what I do, I say I'm a trade historian. So both of my books that were referenced before were Trade Histories, one of the trading system and one of US policy. My training is both as an historian and as a political scientist. And as a political scientist, I tend to place much greater emphasis on power than do a lot of the other people with whom I deal. The argument that I'm going to be presenting here about where we are, how we got here, where we are headed, you'll find in updated and short and distilled form in the working paper, to which I think you gave people a link. But the longer version, which is now about 2 years old, but I don't think there's an awful lot that I would change in the book. My book on trade and American leadership takes more of the historical view, but explains how we got where we are and where I think we are headed. In both cases, it is a largely pessimistic view, especially if what you're after in the trading system is not merely openness, but non-discrimination. And what I foresee is a tremendous increase in discrimination in the system, which may or may not be accompanied by a lot of protectionism. So the argument I have is that the multilateral trading system is in serious danger of losing all relevance as a negotiating forum. And let me stress, I mean the multilateral system, not the international system. The international system consisting of the multilateral plus all the bilateral and regional and plurilateral and so forth components. But I would argue that the free trade agreements that we now see being negotiated among the principal industrialized partners are not so much a complement to the multilateral system. They are a substitute for it, and one that involves a serious step back from the ambitions that we had before. And I emphasize all these trends. One is the shift in the global distribution of power and wealth reduces the US willingness and capacity to lead. Now, again, as a political scientist, I'm very interested in the issues of power and leadership. If you enter the system as an economist or a lawyer, those power considerations may seem less significant to you, but these are fundamental differences in perspective. I suggest that the Sino-American rivalry makes the dynamics of our time fundamentally different from what we had in the GATT era, when it was quite possible to bifurcate the US-Soviet conflict and the US-Japanese conflict. Today, they are conflated in dealing with one power, and that works to the detriment of the trading system. I think that US policy might be returning to protectionist patterns. I'll give some data on that, but it's definitely becoming more discriminatory. And I argue also that even if the Biden administration had bold objectives for the trading system, which I don't believe they do, but even if they did, the current domestic politics of trade cast a lot of doubt on whether they could make good on those ambitions. So before I tease that out, I want to stress a little bit more some foundational matters that are, again, are going to distinguish the argument that I make from the argument you would make if you were a lawyer or an economist. There's a common assumption that I believe is fundamentally false, that the trading system makes power unimportant. So, as I say, I deal with economists who believe in mutual interest. I deal with lawyers who believe in the rule of law. And in both of those professions, and this is a point that I make in my WTO history, they both seem to start from the assumption that one of the purposes of establishing a multilateral trading system is to subtract power from the equation. A second assumption is that there's a sort of commutative value to trade liberalization. If you can't achieve it on a multilateral basis, well, then perhaps you can do it regionally or bilaterally. And in the end, if you have enough bilateral or regional liberalization, that can act as a substitute for the multilateral variety. And there's also a widespread assumption that the problem in the United States was called Trump. And if you get rid of Trump, you get rid of the problem, because we had every American president who was elected since 1932 up until 2016 was one form or another of a free trader, and then we had this temporary deviation that can now be corrected. I think each one of these three assumptions is fundamentally wrong. I won't go into the details of it, you can find it in my book, but I come from a school of thought that was first devised in the 70s and 80s called the theory of hegemonic stability. And it contends that the system tends towards protection or discrimination or both if you don't have a leader that is both efficient and influential. So if you look at the long course of history, when you had a United Kingdom that was very economically efficient, very politically and militarily strong and influential, you had a more or less open trading system. Same thing with the United States. And when you had an interregnum between their two periods of leadership, we had the world essentially reverting to protectionism and war in the 20s and 30s and into the 40s. The argument being that with the decline in American power comes a decline in leadership, and with that also is an increasing drift towards discrimination. And the argument that I make is that the United States actually managed to forestall for decades the reemergence of protectionism, in part because we fell back on two other things. One is, starting in the 1980s, we negotiated more discriminatory trade agreements, which originally were pursued in a complementary fashion rather than as a substitute for the multilateral system, and also forestalled the emergence of protectionism in the United States by emphasizing new issues. And in my book, I try to argue how it is bringing up intellectual property rights, services, investment, diverted the political attentions in the United States, both among industry groups and policymakers, and forestalled for a long time the emergence of protectionism. It finally came about through Donald Trump, but I would argue that Trump really, in addition to overdoing his protectionism, was himself overdue. That is to say, we had people in my school of thought had anticipated someone like Trump for a number of decades. And really, if you look at it from the proper perspective, what you see is the emergence of Trump was increasing the degree in which we were moving in a particular direction, but not a change in the direction. Such that with Biden, if you start from the assumption that Biden as an internationalist is going to undo everything that Trump did, I think you're going to be sorely disappointed. So the argument that I make is that what we have at issue here is more an issue of the long-term rule rather than the short-term exception. Trump was a short-term exception insofar as he exaggerated the degree to which we were headed in a particular direction, but he did not fundamentally change direction, nor will Biden. I can show you in some detail how Biden's trade policy, which is still emerging, may in some senses contain as much continuity as change from Trump's. And we should not mistake the fact that Biden is essentially an internationalist for assuming that he's going to be a multilateralist, which in the trading system are two rather different things. So I want to pursue this argument by looking at three different types of evidence. And one is the declining US leadership and how shifts in the global distribution of wealth and power have reduced the capacity and the willingness of the United States to lead in an environment where no other alternative leader is really emerging. And you may think to yourself, well, if the United States is not lead, are we not finally mature enough to have a more democratic system of governance in the world? And I would argue, well, no, we're not. And I'll try to show you why. First, let's think of what's happened to the soft power of the United States in the course of the last 10 years. And I have two simple measures here. One is political approval of US leadership on the part of the publics in many different countries, and their economic interest in dealing with the United States. So all the blue boxes are data for 2009, all the red diamonds are data for 2019. What's interesting to me is, despite the fact that the United States has become a slightly smaller player in the trading system than it was a decade ago, other countries have become more economically dependent than ever before on the trading system, and thus the share of these partners' GDP that is accounted for by exports of goods to the United States has actually increased over time. So any country for which the arrow is moving in this direction has become economically more dependent on the United States. You do find a few small exceptions, Australia a little bit less, Russian Federation a little bit less, but overall, the direction has been one in which the principal reduction in American soft power is the drastic drop in the share of political approval for US leadership represented in the change from the first Obama year to the second of the last Trump year. We don't yet have data for 2020, hasn't been released yet, and one can only assume that those red diamonds are going to be even farther south than they were before, because we had the pandemic, and then, of course, at the start of this year, an attempted coup, essentially. So the principal decline in recent years has been not countries' economic dependence on the US market, but their political assessment of American leaders, which would lead you to suspect that if you had Joe Biden saying, I want to now take the political capital that we have and invest it in a reinvigoration of the multilateral system, perhaps in a sense of relief, a lot of other countries would say yes, but that's not the US priority. And that's not the US priority for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the growing perception that the principal function of the trading system is as a field for the rivalry between the United States and China. So the data that I'm presenting here is shifting national interests and influence in trade. And I'm starting from the assumption that the typical policymaker in most countries is a mercantilist, a classical mercantilist, in the sense that people think that imports are a loss, exports are a gain. If you think that way, then the influence of a country, as may be measured on the vertical axis, is that country's share of global imports of goods and services. That is to say, the more that a country imports from the rest of the world, the more that it may influence what people do in those countries. And countries' interests in the trading system, as measured here on the horizontal axis, is exports of goods and services relative to a country's GDP. And I'm comparing the very start of the WTO era, 1995, with 2019, again, the year for which we have the most recent data. Now, you can see that there's been a lot of movement, but what I'm going to highlight here are 4 particular points that speak to the problem we face today in a decline of leadership and the absence of a really credible alternative to what US leadership has been. So first, let's look at the United States. What's interesting to me is actually how little change there has been in this regard. The United States is the country that has changed the least, really. Trade has always been a relatively small share of the US economy. And as you can see, it has increased only a slight degree. Also, US influence is only slightly smaller than it was before. The real change is not in overall US influence, it is in the relative level of influence of the United States and China. But to understand the politics of the trading system, you have to realize that the United States matters more to that system than that system matters to the United States. And one of the consequences of that is that US policymakers going back generations have believed that because trade is so much more significant to our partners, one of the things that we can do with trade is use it as an instrument of influence to achieve something else that is extrinsically important. That is to say, trade is less intrinsically important to us than it is extrinsically important as something to trade off in exchange for something else. And in an environment where US policymakers tend to think of their authority as having been diminished, we're more likely to think about what we can achieve in bilateral deals and regional deals, and less likely to think about the multilateral influence, which is the way US policymakers thought of the system all the way through the GATT era and early into the WTO era. Now, what about China? What's interesting to me about China is, yes, there has been this tremendous increase in China's influence. China imports 5 times the share of total global trade that it did at the start of the WTO era. But that increase in Chinese influence has not been matched by an increase in Chinese dependence on the trading system. That is to say, the share of Chinese GDP that is accounted for by its exports, no matter what you might assume is the case, you see that China is only slightly more dependent on the trading system today than it was in 1995. And I look at the US and the Chinese positions, I say they used to be very far apart, they're getting closer and closer. China is a more trade-dependent country, but it is less trade-dependent than the average country in the world. And like their US counterparts, I think rational policymakers in Beijing are going to see that their influence is going to be leveraged better through bilateral arrangements than through a multilateral system. Hence, it is not a leading priority for Chinese policymakers to take over the role that had previously been played by the United States as being the principal sponsor of the multilateral system. Instead, what you find is an accelerating Chinese interest in bilateral and regional deals, and how they can be leveraged just like US deals are leveraged for other concessions in foreign policy and security issues and access to raw materials and so forth. So what about the European Union? Can the European Union instead take the place of the United States? The general trend, as you can see, for EU countries has been, first of all, to become more dependent on the trading system than they were before, in Germany's case, to a tremendous degree. At the same time, their influence is declining for 2 reasons. One is they're accounting for smaller shares of those imports, but we've also had Brexit. And so there's been a fragmentation of European authority. And so European policymakers are not in the same position as Chinese or American policymakers to be thinking about trade arrangements primarily as of being of extrinsic importance, but rather there is a perceived necessity of the intrinsic importance of trade agreements. And the rush to the exits, the rush to bilateralism has been at least as great within the European Union, and the breakaway of Brexit and the perceived need on the part of the United Kingdom to replicate the various bilateral agreements has in fact led to a tremendous increase in bilateral negotiations. So just to think about the possibility of there being some other non-major power center, not the United States, not China, not the European Union. What about a more democratic system? If we wanted to have a system in which the middle powers played a much more effective role, you'd have to have more countries whose profile, as illustrated here, is like India's, but whose policies are like Chile's or Singapore's or other countries that have negotiated a lot of agreements and would prefer to negotiate multilateral agreements, but instead have been forced back on Plan B. India has become more dependent on the trading system and more influential in the trading system. That makes it almost unique among countries in having its interest and its influence increase. We would need to see a lot more countries do that, and they would also have to have policies that are more like those, as I say, of the Singapores and Chiles. But instead, those countries typically view themselves as price takers. They would love to have multilateral agreements, most of them, but they don't have the same capacity to bring them about. In other words, when I look at all of these countries, I see reasons why each one of them is feeling compelled for one reason or another towards a plan B. Okay, second problem, protectionism and discrimination. There's no doubt that US policy has become more discriminatory. I think it is also becoming more protectionist. And what's interesting to me is that we end up in a vicious circle in which protectionism leads to more discrimination and vice versa. First of all, US policymakers, no matter what their partisan label may be, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, are increasingly seeing trade per se as a China problem, and the traditional instruments of trade policy as dealing primarily with China. So this is a rather complicated graph, but let me walk you through it. It has two different axes. China's share of total US imports. This is the start of the WTO era. This is where we came pre-Trump. So China's share went from under 10% to over 20% of total US imports. China's share of the US deficit has increased even more. What Trump did was take a system where the average tariff imposed on imports from China was significantly higher than the average tariff imposed on the rest of the world. So this is the average US tariff on China, this is the average US tariff on the rest of the world against the left axis here, and triple those tariffs. Didn't triple all of them, but he increased many of them to the point where the average tariff paid on US imports from China starting a few years ago to 2019 has gone from about 3% to almost 10%. And China's share of total US tariffs has gone from about 15% at the start of the WTO era to about 2/3. So if you say to the average US policymaker, we want to cut our MFN tariffs, they say, why do you want to do that for China? Why do you want to do that favor for China? Because from their perspective, there's now 4 types of trading partners. There's China, there's our FTA partners, there's the recipients of preferential treatment, the generalized system of preferences or the special preferences for Africa or for the Caribbean Basin countries. And then finally, there's everyone else. And over the course of the last 40 years, we have gone progressively towards a much more discriminatory system. We didn't used to have FTA partners at all. We began negotiating those in 1985. We now have a proliferation of preferential arrangements, and we have China being left essentially as the least favored nation because it's one of the few countries, it accounts for the relatively small share of US imports that are not receiving preferential treatment. We actually have a large number of partners who do not receive preferential treatment, but most of them are much, much smaller than China or the European Union, Japan, Canada, etc. If you say to a US policymaker that we want to reduce barriers on an MFN basis, what they hear is you want to help China at the expense of these countries, our FTA partners and our recipients of preferential treatment. And this becomes this vicious circle where the more we discriminate, the less we are capable of doing things on a non-discriminatory basis because it seems self-defeating. And of course, who gets left behind is everyone else who doesn't have an FTA with the United States, and every country other than China starts to think about, do we want to negotiate an FTA with the United States? But some of those countries also think about whether they want to negotiate an FTA with China. And increasingly what you find is there are very few countries that have FTAs in effect with the United States and FTAs in effect with China. We've got these 6 right now. If we conclude the negotiations that are now underway, it will include Japan, which is very important. But if you break the world down into one block that consists of China plus its current plus its potential FTA partners, and another block that is United States plus its current plus its potential FTA partners, the US block is about 3/5 of the global economy. The Chinese block is about 2/5 of the global economy. And in that Venn diagram, very little of it crosses over. Now, Trump took the position that if you negotiate an FTA with the United States, we will put a lot of pressure on you not to negotiate with China. It's not certain whether the Biden people will take exactly the same approach, although I suspect that they may, they just don't want to say it. but we are headed towards the potential emergence of largely distinct FTA blocks. And again, this encourages this ever-increasing level of discrimination in the system, as does the reemergence of protectionism. Protectionism begets discrimination, and discrimination begets protectionism. Now, what I have here is as a measurement of protectionism in the United States is the average annual initiation of trade cases. And if we wanted to be very fancy about considering what the Trump administration did that was contrary to the letter or the spirit of international law, we would look at these cases up here, the reciprocity, national security, and safeguards cases. But for purposes of my argument right now, what I find most interesting is instead this run-of-the-mill protectionism. The countervailing duty petitions and the anti-dumping petitions. Why? Because that is a measure of protectionist sentiment in the private sector in the United States, because these actions up here, these were largely taken at the initiative of the Trump administration, although not the safeguards cases. These actions, with very few exceptions, were undertaken by the private sector. And what did we see? We went from a high level of protectionist petitioning during the Uruguay round period to a very substantial reduction in that petitioning in what I'm calling the early WTO period up until 2016. And then with Trump, the level of petitioning returned to approximately what it was, as if the Uruguay round had never taken place, as if the commitments that we made in these laws did not take place. So my question is, a year from now, 2 years from now, when we look at the level of petitioning during the Biden term, or when we can first start to say we're seeing the patterns, is it going to look like this, or is it going to look like this? To the extent that protectionism has returned to stay, again, that increases our tendency towards discrimination. So we've got protectionism coming back from the private sector, as exemplified by the AD and CVD petitions. We also have a lot of doubt as to what the Biden administration is going to do with the legacy measures that it's inherited from the Trump administration, especially the restrictions on aluminum and steel and so forth. I find it very interesting that the newly installed US trade representative is back again to talking about how we're going to deal with global overcapacity in aluminum and steel production. I don't see them rapidly or for free eliminating the measures that have been put in place against aluminum and steel. So again, this is something where we have to monitor what's going on and decide to what extent, after we've had a year or two of experience, are we seeing continuity or change from where we were in the Trump administration. And then the third issue is the domestic politics of trade. And I argue here that even if the Biden administration wanted to restore the status quo anti-Trump, it would be very difficult to do because the domestic politics of trade have gotten progressively more difficult over the last few decades. Now, you might not think that if you just look at what the sentiment is among voters in general on trade. If you ask them, is trade a threat or is it an opportunity? We've seen over the course of the last 2 decades, the percentage of respondents who say that trade is primarily an opportunity has increased, and has increased especially among Democrats. And if you think of Democrats as being the protectionist party, I'm sorry, you're wrong. At least in the base, when people think of trade as trade, Democrats are slightly more pro-trade now than Republicans are. But the problem is very few Americans think of trade as trade anymore. When trade issues arise in Congress, the likelihood is that Democrats are going to be thinking about how trade is related to other very partisan issues like labor rights and the environment. And Republicans are going to be thinking about how it relates to foreign policy. What does it mean for competition with China, which Democrats are also concerned over? What does it mean for globalization? Globalization viewed in the very negative Trumpian sense of the term. And members of both parties have developed an increasingly complex set of reasons for being trade skeptical and not being pro-trade in how they vote, even if presidents present them with the opportunities to be pro-trade. Now, what makes it very unpredictable where we are headed is we have not had a lot of data to deal with for a decade now. We've had only one trade agreement that was considered by Congress, and that was the revision of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which passed with a lot of bipartisan support. But what did that mean? Was it people were voting against the old NAFTA by approving the new NAFTA? Were they in favor of free trade? Were they in favor of the trade management provisions of the revised NAFTA? The thing was such a mess that it's very hard to interpret. The last time that we had a lot of trade agreements being negotiated on was in the period preceding 2012. So up through 2011, we had a lot of votes in Congress on trade agreements, and I could tell you who was voting for and against them because they had voting records. We have still a number of people in the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, who initially entered Congress prior to 2012. All these blue, these are people who've been around long enough to say this person has a voting record on trade, and if they're a Republican, they at least in the past got used to voting in favor of trade agreements. But in the House, and especially among Republicans in the House, the people who have that long a tenure in Congress is down to about a third. Over half, or almost half of the Republicans in the House, I should say, almost half were first entering Congress during Trump's period. That is to say, they got voted into office with him in 2016, or in 2018, or in 2020, and it's over half. We don't know how they would vote because either they fell into that category of being Trump Republicans, or they came in this interim period, they first entered Congress, and they have no voting record. But it appears to me that Republicans in Congress now tend to be either Senate Republicans who want to vote together with Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, who is against anything that Biden is for, or they're House Republicans who want to vote against anything that Biden promotes because Trump wants them to oppose it. But whether you're doing it in fealty to Trump or in fealty to McConnell, almost anything that Biden would promote that is pro-trade is going to encounter a fair amount of skepticism from Republicans, and the Democrats are going to be concerned about what does it mean for environmental issues, what does it mean for labor issues, and so forth. No one right now is thinking about trade as trade. And we're unlikely to see that happen in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. What we have had in the last generation is divided government is much more common than unified government. So using the standard division of blue for Democrats and red for Republicans, if you look at the presidency, the House, and the Senate, there are very few times when it's all solid blue or solid red. To the limited extent that we do have solid blue or solid red, it's usually the first 2 years of a presidential term. That's especially been the case since Clinton took office in 1993. But unified government, we have only 1/3 of the time, and the standard pattern, which was the case for Trump, was the case for Obama, and was the case for Clinton, has been you've got only the first 2 years of unified government. Thereafter, it's divided. George W. Bush had the luxury of 6 years of unified government. And presidents emphasize in those first 2 years those things that are their priorities. And Biden has made very, very clear that although he has to deal with trade policy, trade is not his priority in these first 2 years. So that tells us what a president's priorities are. Typically, Biden on most issues, if you want to know what he's going to do, you ask, well, what did Obama do? And Obama, in his first 2 years, worked on healthcare, worked on social issues, worked on everything but trade. He didn't start dealing with trade until in the last 2 years of his first term. He cleaned up some issues that were left over from the Bush administration. And then he started taking on new initiatives in his second term. If Biden were to be around for 2 full terms, I would not be the least bit surprised if he tried to follow more or less the same pattern, but don't expect him really to do much of anything for the next 2 years. So where I'll end is this. The WTO is tied up more with disputes than with negotiations, and I expect that we're going to spend at least as much time in the next couple of years dealing with the hangover of Trump administration legacy protectionist measures, and also this dispute over the appellate body, which predates Trump. How the administration deals with the measures that are in place against China and other partners remains to be determined. They're still reviewing what they're going to do about the steel and aluminum measures. Bilateral negotiations, especially the FTA negotiations underway with Brussels and London, I expect those to be dominated more by trade-related issues, with Washington and London and Brussels all thinking about what are the precedents that we're setting for the relationship between trade and labor, trade and the environment, more than dealing with the traditional issues of openness versus closure. There could be an interesting test of trade politics if the Biden administration feels it necessary to seek a new grant of negotiating authority from Congress. The current one is going to expire in a few months, but they don't really need it until it's time to conclude an agreement. But if you want to look for one thing in the future to tell you where US policy is headed, you want to pay very close attention to what's happening to the politics of trade within the Republican Party and the identity crisis within that party, which has yet to decide whether it is a cult of personality and a Trumpian party, or if in fact it is a party of principle and is really pro-market in the way that it said it has been since the time of Reagan. That's a fight that is still really just emerging. And I will watch it with great interest and possibly with trepidation in the months and years to come. So those are the main points I wanted to make. I apologize for going through them quickly, but again, if you want the long mixed dance version of the argument, I have it somewhat longer in that EUI working paper and much longer in my book. But I turn the floor back to Manuel.
Thank you very much, Craig. This was a very comprehensive picture of a complicated situation, and which is not very reassuring from the point of view of the multilateralism. And you know, in Geneva, we really have this sort of obsession that multilateralism has to be defended no matter what, almost more or less, kind of. So it's very concerning what you're saying. And I certainly have some questions, but I would like to open the floor to our audience. Can you please
stop sharing the screen?
Yes, if you can stop. Yeah, close your screen, Craig.
I'm trying to figure out where here, stop share. There it is. I'm sorry. I was looking for where that button was, and you know, I forgot where you find it.
Okay, so please, as usual, write your question or your comment in a short manner. Do not write a dissertation here, so that I can organize a little bit the questions. Feel free to do it starting now. In the meanwhile, while you think what is your main concern, just to warm up, I was really, well, not surprised at all, but I think it is a very important thing to highlight and to elaborate more, is this trade and issues. So the trade that is not trade, which is trade and environment, trade and labor, trade and intellectual property, trade and social policy, trade and human rights, trade and gender, trade and so on, which has been growing as a sort of mushrooming universe in the last 20 years, more in Europe, I think, than in the US, but well, I don't know exactly who started what and when. But I think this trend will continue as far as I can perceive it from the European perspective. But I would like to compare that with your view, these trade and topics from the US policymakers' perspective. You mentioned some of them already. Do you think that this exponential growth of this agenda will continue?
It's hard to say how many more issues we could reasonably anticipate making their way onto the agenda. What I try to explain in my more recent book on trade and American leadership is how a lot of this we stumbled into accidentally. So there are two different routes by which I think the United States was the instigator in bringing the trade and issues to the table. One was by enacting laws that other countries challenged in GATT dispute settlement. So the emergence of the trade and environmental issues, no environmentalists in the United States said, let's deal with the trading system, but rather US trading partners said, let's deal with these US environmental laws that have a trade component to them. And accidentally, we then stumbled into a series of now famous disputes of turtles and shrimp and so forth. But another way that we brought up those issues was the unintended consequence of the expansion of the negotiating agenda to include issues like intellectual property rights. And intellectual property rights then leads to questions like pharmaceutical patent protection and so forth. So the United States, in a sense, did not intentionally bring all of these issues to the table, but rather took actions that had the unintended consequence of bringing them to the table. But then what we had was a very fertile field for dealing with those issues. The argument I make in the book is drawing on the ideas of people who write about what's called a post-materialist political system, in which people are no longer fundamentally concerned about, am I going to be killed in a war? Am I going to be killed by crime? Am I going to starve to death because I don't have a job? I mean, to the extent that fundamental issues of human survival are largely handled, people tend then to begin dealing with other issues like, I'm concerned about the environment, not just in my country, but in other countries. I'm concerned about fundamental social fairness, not just in my country, but in other countries. And I think there's a lot to be said for comparing the domestic politics of the trade and issues in various countries and getting a cross-national perspective on how they affect our relations. But I'm put in mind of the time when I was hosting a video conference with the Dutch Minister of Trade a few years ago. And I began by briefing all of my students so that they would know what to talk about. Right, here's the traditional Dutch issues about shipping, and here's why you need to be concerned about why they want access to the US cabotage market and so forth. And then the Dutch minister had nothing to say whatsoever about these topics because she was a socialist who was concerned really only with fundamental issues of gender and labor issues and environmental issues, and said almost nothing about trade whatsoever. We have drifted into these areas that I find much less susceptible to negotiation and conclusion, either at the international level or at the domestic level. And that's an issue that I tease out with a great deal of my book. Whether we're going to have more, we already have quite a lot. We already have quite a lot of issues to deal with. I shudder when I think of what else might be added to the agenda.
Trade and astronomy, maybe. I have some 4 questions here. I will deal with them separately because they are not really connected. The first one concerns the sanctions. So the utilization of sanctions in the trade policy of the US. Do you think it will be increased as a tool or not?
Okay.
Want me to take another one, or?
Why don't you give me all 4?
Oh, okay, well, you are multitask, fine. The other one concerns, obviously, the WTO appellate body. How is that going to be resolved in your view, if it is going to be resolved someday? The third one concerns the protectionism, well, you mentioned that the widening protectionism that may probably evolve beyond the usual 2 products of steel, aluminium, and the like. So what is next? What is the expansion of that protectionist trend? And then I have a question regarding the deal between the European Union and China, the preliminary agreement on investment that was concluded at the end of 2020. In case the new administration, the new US administration has some views on that in this overall game of putting China in relation also with the EU as compared to the US and so on. I will stop here. There are other questions that are coming, but I think you have enough so far.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, on sanctions, yes, we're seeing more and more of that. Here's where I want to play a little bit more with this distinction between internationalist and multilateralist. So Trump was neither an internationalist nor a multilateralist. Biden is an internationalist, not, however, to the point of favoring multilateralism as the pinnacle of internationalism. Biden believes in allies, and Biden believes in coordinating action with the allies. So just as it's important to say that if you ask me any question about US trade policy today, the first response is going to be, well, what about China? In what way do US relations with China color the response? That's going to remain true. That was true at least as far back as the Clinton administration. For every US administration since, it's been seen largely as a China issue, and increasingly so. But in the Biden administration, just like in the Obama administration, but not in the Trump administration, the next question is, how can we deal with our allies in order to have a more coherent policy? So one of the issues, again, that I deal with in my book is the recurring conflicts we have had with our European friends and allies on these issues. And I take an historical perspective and look at how this originally played out in the 18th and 19th centuries and all the way up to the present. And it's a recurring issue. And the only thing that has changed is the United States used to be the main cheater in sanctions busting. The United States now has become the country that tries to bring its allies along in a coordinated effort on sanctions. And the position of the United States today is very similar to what it was. The US position today vis-a-vis China is very similar to what it was the US position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And there is a general recognition that sanctions are going to work well if they are done in coordination with the Europeans principally, but with other countries as well. So are sanctions going to be increased? Yes. Is the United States going to increase its pressure on other countries to follow along with these sanctions? Yes. But probably not hopefully not in the way that leads to these concerns that have been perennial over the last couple of generations of the extraterritorial application of US pressure, because it then becomes the secondary disputes, but not just the United States versus the target of the sanctions, but the United States versus the countries that it's trying to strong arm into imposing the sanctions. And you end up there being US-Canadian disputes, US-European disputes over issues such as how we deal with Cuba. Now, we're seeing increasing European Union interest in coordinating activity with the United States, both with respect to China and with Russia. Of course, it's much more difficult for our European friends in dealing with Russia because of their greater economic dependence, especially in the energy area. And again, this is an issue that I deal with in some depth in my book. So the question is not just do we increase the overall level of sanctions, but do we increase and improve the efforts to pursue sanctions in a way that does not engender significant new conflict with our partners. And I can only tell you that the Biden administration will be more attentive to that issue and that question than was the Trump administration. On the appellate body, this is another issue where I think it to a very considerable degree, it involves coordination between Washington and Brussels. The appellate body issue is the type of thing that really fascinates people who are legally oriented, and our friends in the European Union are second to none in that respect. I have a feeling that ultimately this is something that may be resolved within the next year or two. It is an issue that stretches back prior to the Trump administration, but I think the Trump people were trying to exploit the position for reasons other than ultimately resolving it. I think the Biden people do want to resolve it. When it gets to the details of how they do that, I'm sorry, I don't pretend to know all of the ins and outs of what may happen with the AB. I know that that meta dispute is at least as important as the individual disputes that are currently clogging the docket at the WTO. On the question of widening protectionism and what comes next, I think that we're going to see more issues involving procurement than other issues in the coming years. Just think about the fact that we just enacted a $1.9 trillion rescue package, and the Biden administration is now seeking even more money from Congress. They say having dealt with a rescue package, and we now need to enact an even larger recovery package. But the Biden people, the two things you will always hear them talk about is, one, the necessity of dealing with our allies, two, the necessity of promoting Buy American principles. And if you perceive there to be a certain friction between those two principles, you are not alone. And I anticipate that we will be seeing not only these issues of Buy American laws increasing because the Biden administration wants to tighten the laws themselves, but because the Biden administration wants to spend a lot more money on infrastructure projects and so forth than did the Trump administration. So I foresee more activity in that direction than in other aspects of discrimination or protection. But as I say, I will be watching with interest to see what happens with the filing of new trade remedy petitions. And just to be clear, if people are not familiar with US trade remedy law, if a company files an anti-dumping or countervailing duty petition, there's no discretion on the part of the government in pursuing it. They are required by law to pursue these issues to the end if the facts lead in that direction. If the Department of Commerce is convinced that dumping or subsidization occurs, if the International Trade Commission concludes that material injury has resulted, then this leads to anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders, and the president himself could not prevent them from being imposed. So that's why I say the increase in that AD and CVD activity in the Trump administration is what I'll be looking to see if it tapers off or if it continues in the Biden administration. On the EU-China investment deal, we're certainly seeing this as well as many other issues arising as manifestations of the Sino-American rivalry. Like, I can never remember the name of it. China's answer to the World Bank is called the Asia, I can never recall what they call the World Bank substitute, in effect, that they promote. And the United States under Obama and under Trump and presumably under Biden was trying to get partner after partner to not agree to become a subscriber to that bank. I think that in this respect, the difference between the Trump approach and the Biden approach is just how nasty Biden may be willing to be in urging allies not to negotiate investment agreements with China, not to negotiate trade agreements with China, not to sign on to China's development bank and so forth. Obama took a relatively friendly approach to these issues. Trump took a much less friendly approach. I suspect that the Biden people will want to place at least as much emphasis on maintaining good relations with allies and probably not be so naked in the assertion of power. The difference then being how they make the demands, the similarity being in one administration after another, the preference being that countries not go along with the Chinese-sponsored institutions or agreements.
Yeah.
Back to you, Manuela.
Yeah, no, thank you to you. I have some other questions. I think I will collapse one of them, because they are related. But first, something very specific regarding Cambodia and the textile sector. One second, I will go back to the question. The US had an agreement with Cambodia, more market access for textiles and apparel, if there are better working conditions in the textiles factory of Cambodia. Can you foresee this formula to be replicated, perhaps linking gender equality to market access in the US trade policy? This is one question. I will then jump to another one, which concerns the reshoring, the possible reshoring of manufacturing activities in the US, and this is combined with the trend that has been discussed also very much in Europe of, because of the pandemic, as a consequence of the pandemic, reducing the dependency on global value chains, so reducing the overall dependency on the trade at the global level. Maybe these two things can be seen together. And then finally, third question on the semiconductors, particularly those that come from Taiwan, and the dependence on this Taiwanese production that is increasingly. And this is also a political tool for Taiwan to show its independence from China. So how weak a spot is this island for the US?
Okay. By the way, I was scribbling notes on the first question when you gave the second, so I'll probably ask you to repeat that when we get to number two.
Do you want me to repeat?
Once we get to it.
Okay.
On Cambodia, I used to do some work in Cambodia on accession issues about 20 years ago, and I was better versed on those topics then. But let me say, when it comes to textile and apparel preferences, we have two competing groups in the United States that want to use preferential access to our apparel market for political purposes, and they are sometimes at odds with one another. And one you could just generally call the Human Rights Caucus, and these are people who say, let us encourage better working conditions and so forth by rewarding certain partners for good practices in that respect, by greater access to our market. And then there's the regional group, those who say, we want to favor those parts of the world that we like more. And what it comes down to is there's sort of a parallel division in the international system and in US domestic politics when it comes to two different types of least developed countries. And this is something, again, in my book, I discussed this. It really goes back to the 1960s. You've got a pro-Asia group and you've got a pro-Africa group. So in the United States, we have something called the Congressional Black Caucus, and the Congressional Black Caucus consists of African-American members of Congress who are, by definition, parts of the African diaspora, and they prefer giving greater access to African countries, and that's going to be an issue by 2025, when the African Growth and Opportunities Act expires, the authorization for it, there's going to be a move to make the African Growth and Opportunities Act permanent, and the Congressional Black Caucus, which has tremendous influence with Joe Biden, is going to be advocating for that. There's a perception, both with domestically, that whatever you do for one group is at the expense of the other. I'm not going to say that the Congressional Black Caucus is opposed to expanding preferential access for the Asian LDCs, which would be Cambodia, Laos, Nepal, Bhutan, and one or two others that are not coming to mind. But they have a strong preference for fighting for African preferential access over Asian preferential access. So look for that to be an issue in the coming days. I would suppose, as a matter of principle, that the Biden people would want to do both things. But if they had to choose, I suspect that they would choose on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus and the beneficiaries of the African Growth and Opportunities Act. Let me skip over the second question to allow you to repeat it in a moment and answer your third question about semiconductors. Be aware, and this is something I've been thinking of writing an article about, people hear very different things now when you say global value chains. And for years, whenever I heard people talking about global value chains, they presented it in a very positive light and say, look at these global value chains are giving every country an opportunity to find its place, and we're all being interdependent, and that's great. What we find in the pandemic is when you hear American policymakers or those who try to influence American policymakers talk about global value chains, they do so in the context of looking at our vulnerabilities and our access to personal protective equipment, for example, or our access to vaccines. And in an environment where critically important goods like vaccines and PPE and so forth are viewed to be in short supply, and we want to limit our vulnerabilities, you have first, in a limited way under the Trump administration, and now in a much more active way under the Biden administration, utilizing something called the Defense Production Act, and trying, in fact, to make the United States more insulated from global value chains. And the semiconductor issue is falling into that area. Now, you also have, of course, a very long-standing political tie between the United States and Taiwan, which is especially strong in the Republican Party. No one has been seriously talking about a US-Taiwan free trade agreement at the national level. This is something that Republicans at state levels have been enacting resolutions for years saying we ought to negotiate an FTA with Taiwan, but it hasn't been a very active issue. I can tell you, however, that one of the first things that the Biden administration did upon taking office is begin to express somewhat Trumpian-like concerns over the national security implications of our dependence on access to foreign supplies of semiconductors. And this is, again, an issue where I think there's a lot of tensions that will merit close attention in the coming months. And I'm sorry, Manuela, could you please restate the second question so I can answer it properly? About reshoring, manufacturing, and reshoring. You're muted, by the way, Manuela. Manuela, you're muted.
Sorry. One question is very specifically on the influence or the will to bring about manufacturing reshoring to the US in the overall US trade policy of Biden. The other one is a little bit broader than that, but somehow more or less connected. Somebody's curious to hear how you gauge the impact of the pandemic that you were just referring to, by the way, a second ago, on the US trade policy, and also that of other countries, if possible. There is a lot of chatter about countries wanting to bring production of PPE, as an example, closer to home. It's exactly what you were saying, to reduce trade dependency and to increase self-reliance, self-sufficiency.
Okay, well, let me very briefly answer that, because I think with respect to PPE, I already did say something about it. Let me say, when it comes to reshoring, to the extent that the Biden administration and Congress are thinking about this right now, they want to do so through the tax code and not through traditional trade laws or trade agreements. And I must tell you, I have not looked carefully at the tax law provisions that are currently under debate in Congress, simply for the reason that there are those issues that I follow because I'm interested in them, and there are those issues that I follow because someone pays me to follow them. And no one has paid me to follow the issue when it comes to tax law. And let me tell you, I find tax law so incredibly boring that there's no way I would follow it unless someone were paying me to do so. So I don't really know in detail exactly what it is they're doing, but I do know that they intend to deal with the tax code. And this has led to disputes in the past over tax credits and so forth. But that is the main way that they want to address the issue of reshoring.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to a totally different question, which concerns a topic that you love, which is the US and the British governments agreeing on something serious, question mark. If so, what is the estimated time frame about the UK-US possible agreement, and will Congress agree to that? And what will be the British government have to agree not to do as regard to the Irish question? So in other words, will Biden insist on protecting the Easter Agreement in such a way that it would eventually lead to Irish reunification?
I'll carefully sidestep that part of the question. But on a US-UK agreement, there was for a time a concern that just in order to show that they had done something positive in trade, the Trump administration would try to get the British to agree to some sort of FTA light or some type of agreement that they could call a trade agreement sometime before November of last year. And they may have made varying degrees of serious efforts to achieve that. They didn't. My suspicion is that the Biden administration would really want to reach an actual bona fide FTA within the GATT Article 24 meaning of the term. But the Irish question, of course, arises not just in US direct relations with the United Kingdom, but also US interests in influencing the nature of the EU-UK relationship. And you may ask, well, what does this have to do with the United States? Well, two things. One is we have a very significant Irish diaspora in the United States. Second, the Good Friday Agreement which is really the terms upon which the British and the Irish reached their settlement, was negotiated largely by George Mitchell, a U.S. senator who's an old and good friend of Joe Biden's. And so if you say to Joe Biden, Irish issues, the first thing he thinks of is Good Friday Agreement, my good friend George Mitchell. We don't want to undo his handiwork. But even if you just had a generic U.S. president, there's always the concern about what does this mean for the Irish American community and their issues. And as someone who spends some time in the Boston area, where one finds a lot of the Irish diaspora, I can tell you that this is not one of those diasporas that keeps itself quiet when it has a concern. So definitely, even if we weren't talking about direct negotiations with the United States and the United Kingdom, we would have the United States expressing an interest in how these issues are worked out between Brussels and London. On the time frame for an agreement, again, I wouldn't want to get ahead of what the Biden administration itself does. They have given every possible signal, I think, that they do not want to do anything particularly precipitous on trade this year, and probably not during their first 2 years. Is it theoretically possible that we could conclude one of the current FTA negotiations, that we have the United States negotiating FTAs with the European Union, with the United Kingdom, with Japan, and with Kenya? Theoretically, any of those could be concluded within a matter of months if they were very serious about doing it. I don't think they want to do it very quickly. They just don't want to deal with trade when the political capital that would have to be expended on dealing with trade in Congress in the next 2 years would be drawing away political capital from other things that are higher priorities for them, and really demand of them bipartisanship. The Biden people are driven by two realizations on these issues. One is they've got those 2 years that I mentioned before. And secondly, in the experience of the Obama administration, every time they felt that they had to be open in negotiating bipartisanship with the Republicans, they felt at the end that they'd been burned and that the Republicans did not deal with them in good faith. If you want to deal with trade issues, you have to be bipartisan because there's not sufficient support in the Democratic Party. You have to deal with Republicans, and they just don't trust one another. The Democrats in the executive branch and the Republican minority in Congress, really relations between the branches and relations between the parties are as bad now as they have been at any time in the 40 plus years that I've lived in Washington. And the Democrats want to do things for the next 2 years that they can do by themselves, and trade is not one of them. So yes, you could deal with the US-UK agreement relatively quickly, but I don't think they will.
Yes, and I think the same apply even more to the US-EU possible agreement, right?
Yeah, and as I say, when we do conclude those types of agreements, it's simply going to open up a whole new partisan can of worms, because an agreement between the United States and either London or Brussels, there's going to be so much emphasis on the labor issues, on the environmental issues, on the precedents that are being set in those areas, all of which is just going to antagonize Republicans. And trade politics in the United States, as I said before, has over the last generation become progressively more partisan precisely because it relates to these issues. And they just don't want to have to deal with that for now, if they can help it.
Sure. Can we move to another issue, which is very much a Geneva issue, but is also multilateral issue? We have now also a woman for the first time heading the WTO. And on top of that, it is somebody coming with the flag of the African region, so to speak. Is it too early to forecast, to perceive some sort of reactions on the role of the Director General of the WTO in general in Biden's administration, and more specifically on this new Director General, if there is some clue in this regard?
Well, certainly at the level of symbolism, there are policymakers in the United States who will respond in a very favorable way to that. So, for instance, Vice President Harris had a teleconference or something with the new DG, and certainly expressing, how great it is to have a woman from Africa, to have a woman being Director General. That's the sort of thing that undoubtedly, if she comes to the United States virtually or physically, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, will want to have a meeting with her, and that'll be a very good photo op. Does it fundamentally change the relationship between the United States and the WTO? I don't think so. I mean, when I was writing my previous book, My History of the WTO, I very much it was hammered into me when everyone I was dealing with, the limitations that exist on the power of a Director General. There's one time in the last generation that people said it really mattered who the DG was, and that's when they asked Peter Sutherland to be the last DG of the GATT and the first DG of the WTO, and you already had a general agreement existing between the United States and the European Union that they wanted to get the Uruguay round done. We just needed someone who could knock heads together to make it happen. But the DG can't make them be in a position where they want to give the authority to the DG. They have to decide that they want to get something done, and they just need to have someone who brings them there. The comparison that I made when I was asked the same issue or the same question by an African journalist about a month ago, I said, making someone the Director General of the WTO is kind of like telling the captain of the ship, all right, you're now the captain of the ship, but by the way, you don't have control over the engine room. The engine room is what decides how much forward momentum the ship has. So yes, you can control the steering of the ship, but if the ship doesn't have a lot of power behind it, the DG isn't going to make that happen. Now, I fully understand that the public relations aspect of it, the image of it, is very positive, and I wish her well, and I'm sure that this makes a difference in some countries and in Geneva. I don't see it making a fundamental difference in the United States.
Thank you for this clarification, Craig. There are no more specific questions in the chat column, unless I missed something. I hope not. But I have some geopolitical sort of concern where you flag all of them anyway, and we discussed that also in other occasions. It is from the European perspective, from the Brussels perspective, assuming that there will not be, at least not in the 2 years to come, a UK-US trade agreement and not a Brussels-US agreement either. So let's assume that we will live in the next 2, 3, 4 years in a sort of current status quo regarding the lack of agreements that clarify the issues of preferences given across the Atlantic. In that context, how do you see the evolution of the US leadership at the international level, even beyond the international trading system, in alliance with the EU and in alliance with the UK? Because even without the agreement, it's obviously that these two partners are political partners that are really the main protagonists of the US leadership altogether, right? Particularly, of course, if I think about China on the other side of the planet. So how do you see this configuration? You have Washington, Brussels, Washington, London on one side, and then you have Brussels or the European bloc as a potential, not leader, but certainly important player in the overall scenario. And then on the other side, you have China with its own more and more aggressive, by the way, at least language, if not actions. So what is your crystal ball telling you?
The words that come to mind are situational and circumstantial and episodic and transactional. That is to say, I would see different institutions and different configurations and different issues in which the Biden administration will want always, when it can, to cooperate with allies. And the preferred allies are going to be the traditional allies, which is to say the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, not forget Canada, not forget Mexico, when it's appropriate to the issue. And that will variously mean at different times working in NATO, that'll mean working in the World Bank, that'll be working in the G20 or the G7, that'll be trying to come up with entirely new configurations like this new Quad that was unveiled about 10 days ago. And also in an ad hoc manner. I just don't see, for the time being at least, the WTO being a principal forum in which there is this sort of cooperation. And by the way, this is not entirely new. I mean, when I wrote my history of the WTO, despite the fact that it's the official history of the WTO, there's a reason why I called it the history and the future of the WTO, because even at the time when I was asked in 2012 to write it, most people at that time, and this is 9 years ago, if you said, I'm writing the history of the WTO, their first response would be, oh, it's over? And I had to say, well, no, I do see the WTO having a history, but there were already so many doubts as to where the institution was headed, and doubts for very substantial reasons, that we've certainly been asking questions about how much can and will be done in the WTO almost as long as there has been a WTO. So this is not a new development. It's just one that the longer the question goes on, the more it seems to be answered by default, which is the worst way to answer a question like this, as far as I'm concerned. I do see the Biden administration wanting to deal with allies. I do see them wanting to do it in different configurations as the need arises. I don't see it necessarily having a consistency across all issues and across all forums.
Thank you. So a more opportunistic sort of approach, circumstantial, as you said.
Circumstantial, episodic. The term we always used with respect to Trump was transactional, and that I don't want to say transactional because there are different types of reciprocity, and there's transactional reciprocity, and there's a sort of endemic reciprocity. And if you are an internationalist, and if you're devoted to dealing with allies and the rule of law, like Biden is, then there exists a certain level of trust and a level of investment in the relationship that is not purely transactional. And yet it's rather different from there being a time when if you wanted to know what was going to happen in the GATT, you had to be a fly on the wall in the green room and see exactly what was being done among the very small number of ambassadors in that room, primarily the US and EU ambassadors, but not exclusively the US and EU ambassadors. That day is long gone.
Thank you, Craig. Well, I do not have other questions in my chat discussion, and I think we addressed already a lot of them, very diverse also, touching on many aspects, more or less close to the trade and more or less close to the trade end issues. So thank you very much. I will give the floor to Alejandro for some concluding remarks or notes. And thank you also to all because of the participation and the good questions that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuela, and thank you very much indeed, Professor VanGrasstek. This was again a really very interesting great talk. Manuela mentioned at the moment that there could be a link between trade and astronomy. And believe it or not, when you concluded your presentation, I was making a link with a book I just read by a French journalist and writer, Philippe Labro. I Will Swim in Other Rivers, which he has chapters dedicated to stories and things that impacted in his life. And one of these is on the universe and how our knowledge advances little by little. And what the amazing thing about the universe and the rules of the universe is that it can be understood. And hearing you, I thought that in very complex issue with that mixes legal aspects, economic aspects, political aspects, human aspects from different regions. It's very difficult to understand, but hearing you, one has the feeling that everything can be understood. So I think I understood most of what you described. My field is mathematics, not necessarily trade or economics or other things. So I will go back, and I think I will invite all our members to go back to the presentation. Really, thank you very much again for the presentation. And you mentioned at the moment that we will not be able to evaluate if your orientations and your predictions could be evaluated in the short term, but more in the medium and very long term. But I think that we are in a moment in time in politics and in economy in the middle of this crisis that I'm convinced, I have the feeling that things will change. So when things change, I hope that you will be able to come back to give us a great talk and again advances in the knowledge of these very complex issues. So thank you very much indeed again, and thank you very much to all GreyTalks members and to all our visitors for a very interesting session. Thank you very much. Take care, stay safe, and get a vaccination.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.